Hi there, Reid Miller here with Family Storytelling. Glad to have you back. I hope you enjoy today's story. Before we tell the story, I'm going to say hi to a few friends. David and Shannon down in Fort Smith, David and Mary over in Camrar, and Leon and Judy over in Mitchellville. We get together whenever we can, and being good friends, well, we listen to each other when we're telling stories. And we can tell each other just about anything too. Best friends can tell each other almost anything as well. And I hope you have a best friend. Today, before we got together here for family storytelling, I was up on a stool and changing light bulbs up in the ceiling fixture and changing light bulbs in a table lamp. I turned off the light to make sure that it was safe when I took the old bulbs out and put the new bulbs in. I hope you do the same thing. And I was writing. I have a friend who's working on a story and she asked me to help her out. So I wrote down some of my ideas and she could then take a look at those and she could finish off her story the way she wanted, because we're friends, best friends. And this is the story today called Best Friends. When the alarm would go up, Tommy would wake up and he'd reach out and turn the alarm clock off, and then he'd stretch under the covers and then he'd pull the covers back, climb out of bed, take off his pajamas, put on his clothes, go out of his bedroom, go into the bathroom, have a big drink of water, brush his teeth, wash his face, comb his hair. Then he'd go back down the hall to the next door past his and they'd knock. Knock, knock, knock. Grandpa, are you up yet? Oh, sure, Tommy, come on in, his grandpa would say. Tommy and his grandpa and his mom and dad all lived in the same house. Tommy would open the door and there sitting by the window would be Grandpa. Grandpa might have a book he'd be reading, or he might have some paper he'd be writing or drawing on, or he might be looking out the window and listening to the birds or watching what was going on. He and Tommy would visit for a while, and then they'd go downstairs and have their breakfast. Tommy's mom and dad worked a lot. They worked at home, so they were around sometimes, but they were often way busy. And they usually got up and had their breakfasts before Tommy and Grandpa did. And that was okay. Tommy and Grandpa would sit and they'd visit at the table. They would tell stories. Sometimes Grandpa would tell stories about when he was a boy, like the time he had worn some boots with smooth soles when he climbed a tree. And those smooth soles made it hard to keep a solid foot on a tree limb, and he slipped and poked a stick into his leg. It had really hurt and bled a lot too. Or the time he was bicycling, boogity, 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 and he wasn't watching where he was going, and there was a big stone on the road. Well, he hit the stone, fell off the bike, and landed on his back. Oh, it really hurt too. Grandpa didn't mind telling those stories about the accidents he'd happened or the mistakes he'd made, because he figured, well, if I tell young people the stories of the mistakes I made, maybe they'll make fewer mistakes when they're growing up too. And Tommy liked that idea. Every time Grandpa told him a story about, something exciting he'd done or some mistake he'd made, Tommy remembered it. Sometimes they'd go for walks down by the river, or they'd ride their bicycles up around the bicycle path. Sometimes they'd gather a few sticks in a ring of stones in a park, and Tommy would invite friends over, and they'd all gather around as they made a nice little fire, and they'd tell stories. All the kids loved hearing Grandpa's stories too. In the evenings, Tommy and his grandfather and his mother and father would sit at the dining room table and have their dinner together. Tommy and Grandpa usually talked. Tommy's mom and dad seldom talked. Life was kind of hard, and they didn't feel much energy for telling stories at dinner time. One evening it was dinner time and they were having soup. Grandpa went to put a little pepper in his soup, and as he got the pepper shaker and brought it back across the table, well, he had an accident. His hand bumped his bowl, and his bowl spilled some soup on the white tablecloth. Tommy's mom jumped up real quick, ran to the kitchen, came out with a towel, wiped up the soup, and said to Grandpa, "You better stop making these messes. I'm getting tired of cleaning up after you." Well, usually she talked in a kind, loving voice, but, well, she wasn't feeling very good that day, and she'd scolded Grandpa, and Grandpa just looked down. Tommy felt what Grandpa was feeling. He felt scolded too, because that's the way friends are. Feelings are shared amongst friends, and Tommy looked down too. That evening after supper, they didn't visit like they usually did. Tommy just went to his room, Stayed there through the evening. Finally, he brushed his teeth and put on his pajamas and went to bed. The next morning, Tommy got up like he usually did, except he didn't go and knock on Grandpa's door. He just went downstairs and made his own breakfast, and then he walked outside, and that whole day he wondered and wondered and wondered around, thinking, I miss my best friend, because after what had happened the night before, Tommy felt like he'd kind of lost his best friend. Dinner time came, though, and they all gathered up around the table like they'd done before. They were having their dinner, and, well, they weren't talking much, not even Tommy and Grandpa. They'd finished their dinner, and they were having some dessert, some apple crisp and some coffee for the grown-ups. Grandpa had a big bite of apple crisp, and he went to pick up his coffee cup and have a sip, but his hand shook a little bit, and when it did, it knocked over his coffee cup, and that thick, brown, rich liquid spilled out across the tablecloth. Mom jumped up and raced in the kitchen. She got another towel and she started to wipe things up, and then she pushed all the dishes away and she yanked up the tablecloth. She took it into the kitchen and she ran cold water over the stain, but it wouldn't come out. And she came back to Grandpa and she said, "Okay, I've had enough cleaning up after you. From now on, you're going to have your dinner at the little wooden table in the corner in the kitchen." Grandpa looked down again, and so did Tommy. And Tommy felt like he'd lost his best friend. That night, like he'd done the night before, he just spent the evening in his room. The next morning he got up and he went out by himself like he'd done the day before. And that evening, after everything that they had done that day, but Tommy and Grandpa hadn't visited with each other, Tommy and his mom and dad got together in the dining room to have their dinner. Grandpa sat at the little wooden table in the corner in the kitchen having his dinner. And it was soup again. Grandpa loved soup. Tommy loved soup. Soup was delicious, but he didn't feel like eating very much. And as he and his mom and dad sat there at the table in the dining room, barely touching their dinner, all of a sudden there was a crash from the kitchen. Tommy jumped up, his parents jumped up, they raced into the kitchen, and there was Grandpa sitting at the table, looking down again. At Grandpa's feet was one of Tommy's mom's fine china bowls, broken into 20 or more pieces, and spilled out across the floor and splashed up on the cabinets was the soup that had been in that bowl. Grandpa's hand had shaken again, and it was an accident. He didn't mean it to happen. Well, Tommy's mother gathered up all the pieces of the bowl and looked at them. There was no way to fix the bowl. She threw the pieces in the garbage. She got a towel and she wiped up the soup, and then she went over to a cabinet. She opened it up and she took down a wooden bowl. And then, bang, she slammed that bowl down on the table in front of Grandpa. And she said, "From now on, you'll have your soup from this wooden bowl. I'm not going to have you making messes and breaking my fine china. That's enough of that." Grandpa looked down again, feeling worse than ever before. And Tommy felt what he'd been feeling. And then Tommy walked over to a box beside the door. In that box was wood that Grandpa and Tommy's parents had collected to burn in the fireplace in the living room. Tommy looked, and there was a good-sized piece of wood. He took that piece of wood and he walked over to the counter where the knife block was, where all the handles of the knives stuck out. He pulled out a short knife, and then he sat down in the middle of the kitchen floor and he began to slice pieces off of that block of wood. Well, Tommy's mother had watched and seen what he'd done, and so she kneeled down and she looked at Tommy and she said, "Son, what are you doing?" Tommy looked up at his mom and he said, "Mom, I'm carving you a wooden bowl. So when you're old and you have an accident or make a mistake, even if you don't mean to, you'll have a wooden bowl to eat from too." Well, tears welled in Tommy's mother's eyes, and she swallowed hard, wiped her tears. She took the knife and the block of wood from Tommy and set them aside. Then she helped Tommy stand up. Then she went over to Grandpa and she knelt down beside him and she hugged him gently and she said, "I'm sorry. Forgive me, and let's go have dinner in the dining room." Well, Grandpa got up. They all went back in the dining room and they had their dinner together that night. And every night after that, as long as Grandpa was able, they had their dinner there in that dining room. And after that, well, Tommy's mom and dad didn't work quite so hard. And at evening time, they told stories and listened to stories too. Because after that, once again, Tommy and Grandpa were best friends. And that's the story of best friends. As you know, whenever I tell a story, it's a story you can tell too, so have fun with that story. If you enjoyed the program today, or if you enjoy any of the family storytelling programs, and you're able to make a contribution to help pay for expenses, here's where you can send it: paypal.me/Reid Miller Studio. And if times are hard and money's tight, I've been there. Don't worry about it. What matters most is you come and we gather for family storytelling. Well, now, as we wrap up the program, we're going to play a little dance music again. It's that same tune I played before. So if you want, get up on your feet and get to dancing and hopping around. Here we go. Thanks for sharing family storytelling with me. I'll be back again soon, and I hope we see you then. Bye, everybody. Be well.